Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey to understand something pretty fundamental about how we actually see the stars.
Hmm.
You know how we always want the complete picture, the full story behind
Yeah,
things?
absolutely.
Well, imagine looking at a star. We can, pinpoint its location, track its movement across the sky.
Yeah,
Gives us this kind of flat, two-dimensional view.
right, like a picture on a screen.
Exactly. But what's it doing? Like, is it moving towards us or away from us? That's where radial velocity comes in.
And the story of trying to capture that crucial third dimension, especially for the stars, ESA's Hipparcos mission, looked at, well, it's quite a tale. Lots of twists.
Right. And for listeners like us who really like to get the full context, the why behind it all, this deep dive into the history of nailing down this measurement should be really interesting.
Definitely. And we'll be drawing heavily on insights from Michael Perryman's work, particularly around the Gaia mission, but looking back at why getting these radial velocities was so important and frankly so difficult back in the Hipparcos days.
Okay, so our mission today, figure out why these radial velocities are so essential for understanding how stars move, look at the efforts made to get them for Hipparcos, and, well, why those efforts didn't quite pan out as hoped.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, let's jump in. Why do radial velocities matter so much? What's the big deal?
Well, it's interesting because classical astrometry, the kind Hipparcos did, and even Gaia initially, without its dedicated instrument, it's brilliant at figuring out a star's 3D position, where it is and how far away.
Okay, location and distance. Check.
And also its proper motion. That's the drift we see across the sky over years.
Right, the side-to-side movement from our perspective.
Exactly, but that's still only part of the story. Radial velocity is the third component, the missing piece of its total space velocity.
Ah, so it's about the movement along our line of sight?
Precisely. Is it heading towards us? Away from us? How fast? Without that, you just don't have the complete picture of how that star is actually moving through the galaxy.
I like your analogy earlier, like seeing a plane on a map, knowing its direction, but not if it's climbing or descending.
Exactly that. You're missing a whole dimension of its movement.
So without that for the Hipparcos stars, what were we missing out on, big picture-wise?
Well, quite a lot, actually. It really limited our understanding of stellar kinematics and dynamics, both for individual stars and for whole groups of stars.
How so?
You couldn't properly trace stellar orbits within the galaxy. You couldn't fully understand how star clusters form and then, disperse over time. Modeling the galaxy's gravitational potential becomes much harder.
Okay, so fundamental galactic structure stuff.
Right. And there's more. If you measure radial velocity repeatedly over time,
You can see changes.
yes, you can detect the wobble caused by companions, maybe another star orbiting it, or even exoplanets. That wobble shows up as periodic shifts in the radial velocity.
Wow. Okay, so it's crucial for finding other objects too.
It is. But even a single measurement adds so much. It turns that flat map into a more dynamic 3D understanding of where that star fits in the cosmic dance.
Okay, clearly vital information. So when did astronomers realize, hey, we really need this to go along with Hipparcos? Was it an afterthought?
Oh, not at all. The need was recognized really, really early on. We're talking like right back when Hipparcos was first being seriously planned.
How early?
Around the time of the initial Phase A study, that was back in 1979.
1979, wow, so well before launch.
Absolutely. It wasn't something they realized later they'd missed. The Phase A report itself, I think it's pages 1920, explicitly mentions how important radial velocities would be.
So it was baked in conceptually from the start.
Conceptually, yes. And even more, when they were putting together the plan for the input catalog, basically the list of stars Hipparcos would target back in 1982, compiling existing radial velocity data was listed as a specific task.
So everyone knew it was needed, which makes the next part even more puzzling. If it was so important, why didn't Hipparcos just measure them? What stopped it?
Well, that brings us to the core problem, doesn't it? Money. Funding.
Always the way.
Pretty much. Getting the funds needed for dedicated large-scale ground-based facilities to measure radial velocities for, potentially 100,000 stars or more. That proved incredibly difficult.
So even though Hipparcos was a big ESA space mission, getting the complementary ground data funded was a separate battle.
Exactly. And it was a battle they largely lost, despite trying.
Were there concrete proposals, like attempts to build instruments specifically for this?
Several. There was a significant French proposal back in 1980 led by Albert Bijawi.
Okay.
He proposed building a new setup called Corrivel North at the Observatoire de Haute-Provence, or OHP. Cost was estimated around 5 million French francs back then. Maybe, what, 1.7 million euros today-ish?
And what would that have done?
It was designed to be better than existing instruments, measure fainter stars, more types of stars. They estimated tens of thousands of Hipparcos targets needed good velocities. The plan was for a 6-year survey, getting multiple measurements per star.
Sounds like a solid plan. What happened?
Didn't get funded. They tried again with a revised version in '81. Still no go.
Huh. That must have been frustrating. Any other major efforts?
Well, the pressure didn't let up. There was a meeting in Marseille in early 1982, lots of key astronomers there basically saying, look, we need these velocities ready when the Hipparcos data comes out, which they thought would be around 1991 then.
Still pushing for it.
Yeah, and they even tried to make it cheaper, reducing the number of observations needed per star. They planned for both hemispheres, north and south. There was even a proposal for a brand new 1.5-meter telescope down south.
Whole new telescope.
Yep, a collaboration involving ESO, Geneva Observatory, and the French. Cost was about 4 million francs, maybe 1.4 million euros today. They pitched it to ESO in May '82. Rejected. Though interestingly, some think those failed attempts might have sort of spurred the later development of the Elodie spectrograph, which became famous for finding the first hot Jupiter exoplanet.
Small silver lining, maybe, but still, no dedicated program. It feels like they were hitting brick walls.
They really were. Fast forward a bit to 1987, just 2 years before Hipparcos launched. Roger Griffin, from Cambridge, put in a proposal to the UK's Funding Council, SRS.
What was his idea?
2 identical 1-meter telescopes, one north, one south. Relatively modest cost, maybe £1 million then, 2 million euros now.
And his argument.
Very direct. He basically said getting radial velocities would make the Hipparcos data infinitely more valuable, adding that crucial third dimension. And he had strong support from people high up in the Hipparcos project itself.
With that kind of backing, surely.
Nope. Rejected twice.
Twice? Why? What reason did they give?
Well, the UK Funding Council had its own priorities, apparently. And when the case was taken higher up, directly to ESA management.
What did ESA say?
The feedback was pretty clear. ESA's job was space astronomy. Funding ground-based telescopes, even if they directly supported an ESA mission, wasn't in their mandate. That was seen as the responsibility of ground-based observatories and national agencies.
Ouch. So bureaucratic silos, essentially.
You could say that. It pretty much closed the door on getting a big, dedicated, centrally funded program specifically for Hipparcos radial velocities.
Okay, so despite all that effort, no big, dedicated program materialized. But did any radial velocities get measured for Hipparcos stars? Did individual astronomers manage to chip away at it?
Yes, thankfully. It wasn't a total wash. Individual astronomers and observatories really stepped up using the telescope time they could get. But it was a huge effort, requiring piecing things together, competing for time.
Resourceful, at least.
Yeah.
Can you give us a flavor of these smaller, successful programs?
Sure. There was Charles Fehrenbach at OHP in France. He started a survey around '82 focusing on northern, hotter stars, early-type stars. He managed to cover about 60% of those in the northern part of the Hipparcos list.
Okay, so a good chunk for that specific type. What about the southern hemisphere?
Down south, ESA ran a couple of key programs at Lucia, starting late '88. They used the 1.52-meter telescope there, looking at nearby hot stars and also stars in specific groups called OB associations.
Right. And what about cooler stars, like our sun?
For the northern cool stars, the late-type ones, there was actually an ongoing program using the Corvell instrument on the Swiss telescope, also at OHP. It had been running since 1977, even before Hipparcos was selected, studying various types of stars, and many of them ended up being Hipparcos targets anyway.
Convenient.
It was. And then for the southern late-type stars, another ESO key program got approved in early '89. This used Corvell South on the Danish 1.54-meter at Lucia.
So patching it together from different efforts.
Exactly. The southern program aimed for about 20,000 cooler stars, trying to get 2 measurements for each. It ran until about mid-1995.
Okay, so quite a few different programs contributing data. Adding it all up, how much of the Hipparcos catalog actually ended up with the radial velocity measurement by the time the main catalog came out?
Well, that's the thing. Despite all these valuable efforts, when the big Hipparcos catalog was released in 1997, only about 20,000 stars had widely available published radial velocities.
20,000 out of...
Out of about 120,000 stars in the main Hipparcos catalog.
Wow, so less than 20%.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
pretty small fraction. And, it wasn't missed. Lots of scientific papers using the Hipparcos data after 97 specifically commented on this gap. Some even question, shouldn't this have been part of the mission package from the start?
It really does feel like a missed opportunity, despite the amazing achievements of Hipparcos itself.
Yeah.
Did this whole struggle, did it directly influence how they planned the next big astrometry mission, Gaia?
Oh, absolutely. Hugely influential. The memory of that long, often frustrating struggle to get radial velocities for Hipparcos was a major, major factor in planning Gaia.
How so? What did they decide to do differently?
They decided from the very early stages, even before Gaia was officially approved around the year 2000, that radial velocity measurement had to be integral to the mission, not an add-on, not something left to ground-based effort.
So build it into the satellite itself.
Exactly. The key strategic shift was to put a dedicated instrument, the radial velocity spectrometer, or RVS, right there on board Gaia, measuring radial velocity at the same time as the position, distance, and brightness for every star it observed.
That completely changes the game. No more begging for ground telescope time.
Precisely. It bypasses all those funding and access issues. And the RVS was designed to be capable enough to measure velocities for all stars down to a certain brightness limit, around magnitude 13, which is pretty faint.
Ensuring comprehensive coverage right from the start.
That was the goal, a truly complete data set for a massive number of stars.
And how has that worked out in practice? Has Gaia delivered on that promise?
Phenomenally well. If you look at the latest big data release, Gaia EDR3, it includes high-quality radial velocities for over 7 million stars.
7 million, compared to 20,000 for Hipparcos.
Exactly. And with really good precision, too, typically between zero point 0.2 and 3 kilometers per second accuracy. It's just a completely different scale.
That's incredible. It's a stark contrast, isn't it?
It really is. It shows the evolution from recognizing the need but struggling to meet it with Hipparcos to making it a core built-in capability with Gaia.
So wrapping this up, it's been a long, hard road to get this complete 3D picture of stellar motion.
Definitely. The journey from recognizing the importance of radial velocities to actually implementing a system to measure them comprehensively from space was decades long and full of challenges.
And understanding that history, I think, really helps appreciate the incredible richness of the data we have now from missions like Gaia.
Yeah.
It wasn't just handed to us, it came from learning tough lessons.
It shows how science progresses, how priorities shift, and how persistence eventually overcomes big obstacles.
It really does. And it leaves you thinking, given how much effort this obvious third dimension of motion took to measure systematically, what other measurements that seem crucial today might have faced similar hurdles we've forgotten about? Or maybe what current limitations in our observations will scientists in the future look back on and think, why didn't they just measure that? It's fascinating. And, we touched on how Gaia did get its spectrometer on board.
That's another story in itself.
Exactly. How that actually happened, how the RVS became part of Gaia. Well, that sounds like a tale for another deep dive.